At my father's birthday dinner, my mom stood up and said, "You don't belong here anymore." 30 minutes later, I stood up too, but not for the reason anyone expected. It was supposed to be a celebration. My father had just turned 70, and the whole family had gathered at the long wooden table in the dining room, the one that had held decades of holiday meals, quiet arguments, and half-hearted reconciliations. There were balloons tied to the backs of chairs, mismatched candles stuck into a cake that leaned just slightly to one side, and the smell of roasted chicken filling the house. From the outside, it might have looked like a picture of family warmth. But from my seat, it felt like walking into a storm you couldn't see, only sense. My mother had been short with me from the moment I arrived. No hug, just a thin-lipped, "You made it." When I offered to help set the table, she waved me off, her eyes darting toward my younger brother's wife instead, who was greeted with smiles and chatter as if she were the daughter my mother wished she had. I kept telling myself not to let it get to me. It was Dad's birthday, after all. I wanted the evening to be about him, not about the unspoken tension that had been simmering between my mother and me for years. But the tension didn't stay unspoken for long. The dinner started quietly enough. A few toasts. A few forced laughs. My father sat at the head of the table, smiling in that tired way he did when he was just happy everyone had shown up. He didn't notice how my mother's smile never quite reached her eyes. She poured wine for everyone but me. She complimented everyone's careers, everyone's children, except mine. Every comment felt like a thread pulling loose, one tiny tug at a time. And then, halfway through dinner, she stood up. She didn't clink a glass or ask for attention. She didn't have to. The scrape of her chair and the sharpness in her posture were enough to silence the room. She looked directly at me. And she said it. "You don't belong here anymore." The words didn't land like a shout. They landed like a verdict. Calm. Certain. Final. For a moment, no one moved. My fork hovered halfway to my mouth. My father's smile faltered. My siblings shifted in their seats, staring at their plates as if the food had suddenly become fascinating. I sat frozen, the words echoing in my head. I had always felt like the outsider in this family. Too different. Too independent. Too unwilling to play the quiet, grateful daughter my mother seemed to expect. But hearing her say it out loud, "You don't belong here anymore," was something else entirely. I didn't argue. I didn't ask why. I just sat there, staring at my mother, feeling something shift deep inside me. Because she thought those words would break me. But all they did was wake me up. The silence after her words felt longer than it was. 30 seconds. Maybe less. But it stretched until it felt like no one at that table would breathe again. My father stared at his plate, the fork in his hand trembling slightly, as though he wanted to speak but didn't know how. My brothers exchanged uneasy glances, and my sister's eyes darted to the doorway like she was praying someone would interrupt this moment. But no one did. My mother sat back down slowly, deliberately, like she had just delivered an announcement and didn't need to explain herself. It wasn't the first time she'd made me feel like I didn't belong. It just happened to be the first time she'd said it out loud. And with that single sentence, memories I'd buried began to unearth themselves all at once. I thought of the birthday parties as a child, when my brothers got the best slices of cake and I got the corner with too much frosting, like it was an afterthought. I thought of school plays where she skipped my part entirely in her retelling but praised every moment my siblings stood on stage. I thought of the way she always seemed to have an extra hug, an extra smile, an extra kind word for everyone, except me. I had learned to live with it. Learned to swallow the sting and pretend it didn't hurt. Learned to sit at this table and make conversation while pretending not to notice the invisible line drawn between me and everyone else. But now, there was no pretending. She had ripped the curtain down for everyone to see. "You don't belong here anymore." The words sat between us like something sharp and unmovable. I didn't look at her. Not yet. Instead, I studied my father. His hands. His face. The way his mouth opened and closed, like he wanted to defend me, but couldn't. Maybe he'd been defending me in small, quiet ways for years. Or maybe he hadn't. Maybe his silence had always been permission. The rest of the table shifted back into forced conversation. My sister-in-law started talking about a trip she'd taken last month. My brother made a joke about the weather. The sound felt unnatural, thin, like static filling dead air. But I couldn't stop hearing those words. I couldn't stop feeling them. I realized that for years, I'd been fighting for a place at this table. I'd been trying to earn my chair, to soften my edges, to make myself acceptable in ways I couldn't even name. And here was my mother, confirming what I had always feared, that nothing I did would ever be enough. She didn't want me here. Maybe she never had. But here's the thing she didn't understand. Her words didn't hollow me out. They hardened me. They didn't shove me out the door. They reminded me I could walk through it myself. As I sat there, my hands resting lightly on the tablecloth, I felt something new brewing inside me. Not the shame she wanted me to feel. Not the quiet compliance she expected. Something sharper. A decision. And though I stayed seated for the next half hour, smiling faintly while they ate cake and chatted like nothing had happened, something inside me had already stood up. Because she thought she'd ended something. But really, she'd just started it. The clinking of forks against plates felt too loud. Every scrape of a knife sounded like an insult. People were talking again, but no one was saying anything. My sister-in-law leaned over to tell my brother something about a vacation. My father nodded absently when someone offered him more wine. But under the table, my hands stayed still on my lap, fingers pressing into my knees just to keep myself grounded. I wasn't angry. Not yet. I wasn't sad either, not the way she wanted me to be. I was awake. Her words had cracked something open. And through that crack, years of moments came rushing in. I thought of the holidays where she made me sit at the far end of the table, almost in the kitchen, so the important seats could go to others. I thought of the time I got my first promotion, brought home a bottle of wine to celebrate, and she shrugged and said, "Well, let's see how long you keep it." Every memory felt like another tiny cut I hadn't tended to, and suddenly, they were all bleeding at once. I studied her across the table. The way she was smiling now, chatting easily with my brother's wives, as if she hadn't just told her daughter she didn't belong here. That was always her way. Deliver the sting, then cover it with sweetness so no one else noticed how deep it went. But I noticed. I always noticed. And for the first time, I wasn't willing to patch myself up quietly again. Something shifted in me. It wasn't a single thought. It wasn't, "I'm leaving." It wasn't, "I'm done." It was quieter. A thread snapping. A stillness that came when you realize you don't have to fight for a place at a table that was never set for you in the first place. I glanced at my father again. He looked smaller somehow, like the weight of years had finally settled on him. He didn't look at me. He didn't look at her. He just kept cutting his food, his hand trembling slightly. I wondered if he wanted to say something. Or if he had given up on saying anything at all. For a second, that hurt more than my mother's words. But then I let it go. Because this wasn't about him. Not anymore. I sat there, still, for another 20 minutes. Smiling faintly. Nodding when someone mentioned the cake. Passing dishes down the table like nothing had happened. But inside, I was gathering myself. Not like someone bracing for an argument. Like someone sharpening a blade. Because I wasn't going to cry this time. I wasn't going to beg. I wasn't even going to raise my voice. I was going to do something she didn't expect. Something she couldn't dismiss as drama or overreaction. Something she couldn't twist into another story about how I had ruined the evening. I was going to stand up. Not to leave in shame. Not to prove her wrong. Just to prove to her, to myself, to everyone at that table, that I wasn't going to sit there anymore, waiting for her to tell me where I did or didn't belong. The words had been sitting inside me like a stone for half an hour, pressing heavier with every bite of food I pretended to take, with every forced laugh I pretended to share. My mother thought she'd ended the conversation when she sat back down. That's how she worked: sharp words, then silence, then a look that dared you to bring it up again so she could accuse you of ruining the mood. Not tonight. I looked around the table as the minutes ticked by. My siblings were doing their usual trick, pretending not to hear the things that were uncomfortable to acknowledge. Their spouses smiled politely, their eyes sliding away when they caught mine. Even my father hadn't said a word. That hurt, but it didn't surprise me. He had lived with her voice longer than I had. And maybe after all those years, it was easier for him to stay quiet than to fight. I sipped my water and let the quiet rage settle, not into an explosion, but into something more deliberate. Because anger burns fast. But resolve? Resolve burns slow. I didn't want to yell. Yelling would give her a story, another tale to tell about her dramatic daughter who always makes everything about herself. No, this wouldn't be yelling. This would be cutting glass with a whisper. I thought about every time she dismissed me. Every time she'd made me feel like a guest in my own family. Every time she'd told me I was too much, too sensitive, too different. And then I thought about the moment she stood up tonight and decided to put it all into words. You don't belong here anymore. That was her mistake. Because once something like that is spoken out loud, it can't be taken back. I placed my fork down carefully, the tiniest clink echoing louder than it should have. My mother's eyes flicked to me. She knew. Not what I would say. Not exactly. But she knew I wasn't going to keep sitting there. I straightened in my chair. I didn't speak yet. I just let the silence build again, the same silence she had created, only now it was mine. She didn't like that. I saw her fingers twitch against her wine glass. That gave me the smallest smile. Because for the first time in a long time, she wasn't in control of the room. I looked at my father. He looked back at me for the briefest second, a flicker of something in his eyes, guilt maybe, or regret, or just recognition. Then I looked at her. I didn't speak. Not yet. Because I wanted that 30 minutes she gave me, 30 minutes of sitting there like an afterthought, to turn into the longest pause of her life. When I finally stood, the sound of my chair scraping against the floor was louder than any shout could have been. Everyone turned. Every fork stilled. Every laugh died. And for the first time since she spoke, all the attention was on me. I didn't shake. I didn't falter. Because I hadn't just decided to stand. I had decided what to say. And when I opened my mouth, it wasn't going to be a plea for space at her table. It was going to be the reminder that I didn't need her table at all. The room was silent when I stood, but it wasn't the kind of silence she controlled. It wasn't the fearful hush that always followed her sharpest comments, the silence where everyone stared at their plates, pretending not to notice the sting. This silence belonged to me. I didn't rush. I let the weight of the chair scraping back, the sound of my napkin being placed deliberately on the table, settle into the room like a bell that had just been struck. My mother's eyes narrowed. What are you doing? I looked right at her, really looked at her, and for the first time in years, I didn't feel small. I've been sitting here for 30 minutes, I said evenly, thinking about what you said. Her lips pressed into a tight line, but she didn't speak. You said I don't belong here anymore. I let the words hang in the air, repeating them so they were hers and mine all at once. Around the table, no one moved. My brothers stared into their glasses. My sister twisted her napkin in her lap. My father sat perfectly still, his hand on his fork frozen in midair. I could have yelled. I could have shouted back every insult she'd ever thrown, every dismissal, every cold look that had chipped away at me over the years. But yelling would have given her exactly what she wanted, something to point at and say, "See? She's unreasonable. She's dramatic. She's the problem." So I didn't yell. I lowered my voice instead. "You've made me feel like I don't belong for years." Little comments. Little cuts. Always sharp enough to sting, never big enough for anyone else to notice. And I stayed quiet. Every time. Her fingers tightened on her wine glass. "Not tonight," I said simply. I turned to my father. He met my eyes for just a moment, long enough for me to see that he knew. He always knew. And then I looked back at her. "You wanted to say it in front of everyone," I continued. "So I'll answer you in front of everyone." I stepped back from the table, my hand steady, my voice steady. "You're right. I don't belong here. Not in the way you've defined it. Not under your rules. Not sitting in a chair you think you can pull out from under me." A ripple of discomfort passed through the room, like someone had opened a window in winter. I didn't flinch. "But here's the thing," I said, leaning just slightly forward. "I don't need your approval to belong. I don't need your permission to be part of this family. And I'm done pretending that I do." She started to speak, some sharp retort forming on her tongue, but I cut her off before the first word left her lips. "No," I said softly. "You've talked enough." The room felt like it was holding its breath. I wasn't shaking. I wasn't crying. I was done. I straightened my shoulders, took a breath, and let the calmest words I'd ever spoken finish the moment. "I'm standing because I choose to. And after tonight, I won't be sitting here waiting for you to decide if I'm welcome." Her face hardened, but I didn't look away. Because this wasn't about her anymore. This was about me. I stood there for a moment longer, the weight of my words still hanging in the air like a bell that had been struck and was still vibrating. My mother's expression didn't crack, she was too practiced for that. Decades of control had built her face into something unreadable. But I saw the flicker in her eyes. Just for a second. That small flash of surprise that told me this time, she hadn't been prepared. I turned slightly, looking around the table one last time. My brothers wouldn't meet my gaze. My sister looked like she wanted to say something but couldn't find the courage. And my father looked at me, really looked, and in his tired eyes I saw it, guilt, maybe, but also something softer. Something like pride. I didn't need him to say anything. I didn't need any of them to. Because I wasn't standing there for their permission. I was standing there for me. I picked up my bag from the back of my chair, slow and deliberate, as if every motion was a sentence of its own. I placed my napkin gently on my empty plate. My mother broke the silence first. "If you leave now, don't think you can just come back whenever you want." Her voice was sharp, but I heard what was underneath it, the edge of panic. I didn't look at her. I didn't need to. "You made it very clear where I belong," I said quietly. "And it's not here." I turned to my father, and for a moment, my voice softened. "Happy birthday, Dad." He opened his mouth, like he wanted to stop me, or maybe to say something he'd never had the courage to say. But no words came. And then I walked. The sound of my footsteps was the only thing in the room. No one moved to stop me. No one dared. The front door felt heavier than usual, but when it closed behind me, the air outside hit my skin like fresh water. It was cool. It was clean. It was mine. I stood on the porch for a moment, listening to the muffled voices inside start up again, all forced and frantic, like they were trying to patch over what had just happened. I smiled. Not because I was happy. Not because what she'd said hadn't cut deep, it had. But because for the first time in my life, I wasn't sitting at that table waiting for her to throw me scraps of belonging. I was done waiting. I walked down the steps, past the balloons tied to the railing, past the cars lined up in the driveway. Each step felt like it was carrying me further from the version of myself who had sat there for so many years, swallowing hurt and pretending it was fine. By the time I reached the street, I felt lighter. Not because the pain was gone, pain like that doesn't vanish in one night. But because I'd chosen something stronger than pain. I'd chosen myself. And I knew something now that she never wanted me to know. I never needed her to tell me where I belonged. I never needed her table. I could build my own. And when I did, she wouldn't have a seat unless I said so.